The boardroom went silent the moment the general counsel said my name into the microphone, not because anyone recognized my face, but because nobody in that room had ever heard the actual name attached to the trust that had quietly held 61% of Holloway Industries for the last 22 years. And I watched my son-in-law Ethan's expression shift from mild curiosity to something closer to disbelief as he realized the elderly man in the gray cardigan sitting at the far end of the table, the same man he'd spent 4 years calling Claire's dad, with a faint, barely concealed condescension, was about to determine whether he kept his job as CEO for another single day. My name is Arthur Holloway, I'm 68 years old, and I founded this manufacturing company 40 years ago in a rented warehouse with 3 employees and a loan I nearly didn't get approved for, building precision industrial components that most people have never heard of but that end up in machinery running quietly underneath half the country's infrastructure. I stepped back from day-to-day operations 14 years ago after a heart attack scared me into finally listening to my cardiologist, structured my ownership through a private trust specifically so the company could hire professional leadership without the awkwardness of employees wondering whether the founder was hovering over every decision, and hired a search firm to bring in outside executive talent rather than promoting from inside a company that had, frankly, grown too large for the informal management style I'd built it on. Ethan joined the company as a mid-level operations director 6 years ago, 2 years before he ever met my daughter Claire at a mutual friend's wedding, and by the time he and Claire started dating seriously, he'd already climbed to vice president of operations entirely on his own merit, through a hiring and promotion process I had deliberately walled myself off from, communicating with the board and the search committee through my attorney rather than directly, precisely so that no one, including Ethan, would ever have reason to suspect the quiet, unremarkable investor behind the trust that owned controlling interest was also the father of the woman he was courting. I want to be honest about why I kept it that way even after he married Claire 3 years ago, because it wasn't simply an accident of corporate structure that persisted by inertia. In the early months of Ethan and Claire's relationship, at a family dinner where Claire had proudly introduced him as a rising executive at some manufacturing company, Ethan had asked me, with the polite but unmistakable condescension of a young man sizing up his girlfriend's aging, unremarkable father, what exactly I'd done for a living before retiring. I told him, truthfully but vaguely, that I'd worked in manufacturing management for years before stepping back, and I watched something in his face settle into a category, a box he'd apparently decided I belonged in, somewhere between harmless and mildly irrelevant. A retired middle manager living comfortably enough but not a man whose opinions carried any particular weight in a world of executive strategy and shareholder value. That category never really shifted over the following years, even as Ethan climbed to Chief Operating Officer and then, 18 months ago, to Chief Executive Officer of the very company I'd built and still controlled, a fact he had absolutely no reason to suspect since my name appeared nowhere in any public filing, hidden behind the trust's formal legal name and a board of directors who'd been sworn to confidentiality about my identity as a condition of their appointment. At family gatherings, Ethan would talk expansively about board strategy, about difficult decisions regarding plant efficiency, about the pressures of leading a company with thousands of employees depending on his judgment, always in a tone that implied these were concerns operating at an altitude far above anything a retired man in a gray cardigan could possibly appreciate or contribute meaningfully to. He once spent nearly 20 minutes at Thanksgiving explaining, slowly and with visible patience, what a supply chain disruption was, as though I hadn't personally weathered 3 recessions and 2 of them by hand-delivering parts to customers myself when our shipping contractors failed us. Claire would occasionally catch my eye across the table during these monologues, a small apologetic look, though she, like Ethan, had no idea the company he was describing so grandly belonged, in every meaningful legal sense, to her own father. I let it continue partly out of genuine principle, believing Ethan deserved to build his career and his sense of professional identity without the complicating shadow of his father-in-law's ownership hovering over every decision he made, and partly, I'll admit now, out of a certain wry curiosity about who Ethan actually was underneath the polished executive persona, since a man reveals himself far more honestly to someone he believes has no power over him than to someone he knows does. What I learned, over 18 months of watching Ethan run my company from the careful distance my trust structure provided, concerned me more than I let on at any family dinner. He was competent, genuinely skilled at operational efficiency, the quarterly numbers under his leadership looked solid on paper, but the board had started receiving anonymous concerns from several long-tenured plant managers about a pattern of decisions that optimized short-term executive bonus targets at the expense of long-term workforce stability. Decisions like deferring critical equipment maintenance to hit quarterly cost targets, or quietly reducing safety inspection frequency at two of our older facilities, changes technically within regulatory minimums but well below the standards I'd insisted on for 4 decades, specifically because I'd started this company after watching a friend lose 2 fingers in an improperly maintained machine at the factory where we'd both worked as young men. The crisis that brought me into that boardroom happened 6 weeks ago, when a routine equipment failure at our Ohio facility, the kind of failure that should have been caught by an inspection schedule Ethan had quietly thinned out 8 months earlier, injured a longtime employee named Daniel Reyes badly enough to require 2 surgeries and likely permanent nerve damage in his left hand. Daniel had worked for this company for 11 years, started on that same floor as a machine operator and worked his way up to shift supervisor, the kind of loyal, steady employee I'd always considered the actual backbone of everything we'd built, far more so than any quarterly earnings statement. I found out about it not through official channels, which had characterized it internally as an unfortunate but unavoidable equipment malfunction, but through my old plant manager friend, a man who'd worked the floor with me in the earliest years of this company and still called me personally whenever something felt wrong, who told me plainly that this accident had been entirely preventable and that at least 3 separate maintenance requests for that specific piece of equipment had been deferred or denied over the preceding year, decisions traced directly to cost-cutting directives from the executive level. I spent the following 2 weeks doing something I had deliberately avoided doing for 14 years, quietly reviewing operational decisions at a granular level through my attorney and the board's audit committee, confirming what my old friend had told me and finding, underneath it, a broader pattern that made clear Ethan had been systematically prioritizing the metrics tied to his own executive bonus structure over the safety standards I'd built this company's entire reputation on. When I finally understood the full shape of it, I made the decision to attend the board meeting scheduled to review the Reyes incident, not as Claire's quiet, unremarkable father, but for the first time in 14 years, as the majority shareholder exercising his right to be present. Ethan didn't recognize the significance of my presence at first, greeted me in the hallway before the meeting with the same mildly condescending warmth he'd always shown me, asking whether Claire had sent me to observe some community outreach initiative, genuinely unable to imagine any other reason his father-in-law might be sitting in on a board meeting. It wasn't until General Counsel formally introduced me by my full legal name, Arthur Halloway, as the beneficial owner of the trust holding controlling interest in the company, that I watched every assumption Ethan had built about me over 6 years collapse in real time across his face, disbelief giving way to something like panic as he began, visibly, recalculating every conversation, every dismissive comment, every moment he'd spoken about the company's strategy in front of me, as though I were simply a retired man too far outside the world of real business to understand what he was actually describing. I didn't say much during that meeting, letting the audit committee present their findings plainly, the deferred maintenance requests, the safety inspection reductions, the direct line connecting those decisions to Daniel Reyes's 2 surgeries and likely permanent injury, and the bonus structure that had rewarded exactly the kind of short-term thinking that had put a man's hand at risk to hit a quarterly target. When it came time for me to speak, I kept it simple, told the board that I had built this company on the specific belief that no employee should ever be injured because leadership prioritized a number on a spreadsheet over the actual human beings running the machines that generated it, and that I expected the board to conduct a full review of Ethan's leadership with that principle as the standard being measured against, not the quarterly earnings he'd otherwise be judged on. Ethan was placed on administrative leave that same week pending the review, and the family dinner that followed 2 days later was unlike any conversation we'd had in the 6 years he'd known me. Claire, who'd learned about my ownership the same day Ethan had, sat between us at that table with an expression caught somewhere between shock and something more complicated, the particular vertigo of realizing your husband and your father had been circling each other for years inside a hidden hierarchy neither of them had understood the same way. Ethan, to his credit, didn't try to argue his way out of what the audit had found, didn't reach for the same smooth explanations I imagine he'd used on the board before I ever walked into that room. He asked me, quietly, whether I'd known who he was the entire time we'd known each other, and I told him the truth, that I'd known from the very first family dinner, the one where he'd asked what I'd done for a living and filed my answer away into a category that apparently never once needed revisiting in 6 years. The board's review concluded 3 weeks ago. Ethan was not reinstated as CEO, though the company, at my recommendation, offered him a lower operational role focused specifically on manufacturing safety standards, a position that would require him to spend considerably more time on plant floors than in boardrooms, working directly under the same safety protocols he'd previously deprioritized. He accepted it, not entirely graciously at first, though something in him seems to have genuinely shifted over these last few weeks, less performance in his voice at family dinners now, more actual questions, the first real curiosity he's shown toward me since Claire first brought him home. Daniel Reyes is recovering slowly, his nerve damage likely permanent in some capacity, though the company has committed to full ongoing medical coverage and a settlement I insisted on personally overseeing. I don't know yet what kind of man Ethan will become in this new role, whether the humility currently visible in him will hold once enough time passes for old habits to feel safe again. But I know now, with a clarity 14 years of quiet distance never quite gave me, exactly who my son-in-law becomes when he believes no one with real power is watching closely enough to notice, and I intend to keep watching, not as Claire's harmless father in a gray cardigan anymore, but as the man who built this company specifically so that men like Daniel Reyes would never have to pay, with their own bodies, for someone else's quarterly bonus. Claire and I have talked more in these past few weeks than we have in years, conversations that started, awkwardly, with her asking why I'd never told her, and settled eventually into something more useful, both of us working through what it means to watch someone you love get tested by circumstances they never saw coming and never asked for. She told me once, sitting on my porch on one of these evenings, that she used to feel a small ache watching Ethan explain the business world to me at family dinners as though I couldn't possibly keep up, and that some part of her had always wondered why I never once corrected him. I told her the truth, that I'd been curious, in a way I'm not entirely proud of now, to see who he actually was underneath the performance, and that I'd gotten my answer, both the parts one wish I hadn't and the small, still unfolding parts that give me some cautious hope for who he might still become.